I'm going to go ahead and admit all. Here we go.
How about that? Admit all.
Hi, everybody. Oh,
Welcome. If you're ready for starting, Bob.
yep, yeah, you go right ahead and give the welcome, Irene.
Okay, thank you. Am I unmuted here? Yes. If everybody could please mute themselves for the time being. My name is Irene Etkin Goldman. I am board chair of the Coalition for Peace Action, and I'm so delighted to welcome you to our 42nd conference. And we are blessed to have Sister Simone coming on to speak shortly. She gave a beautiful sermon this morning, which you'll be able to view at some time as soon as we can get the link posted. So I'm welcoming you, and also wanted to say before Bob gets to speak, I want everyone who's on to, if you would, get ready to make the peace sign and get ready to clap silently. We're celebrating Bob's 40th anniversary year as executive director of the Coalition for Peace Action. And there's more to come in December when we have a party. But for today, please give him your well wishes. And September 8th was declared Reverend Bob Moore Day in Princeton. And to our beloved executive director, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Irene, and thank you for your excellent leadership over many years as well, including the last 16 years as our board chair. But it's been a blessing for me, and I feel honored. And one of the blessings is that we get to meet wonderful people like Sister Simone and hear their really great peacemaking initiatives. And so I'm not going to say a lot about Sister Simone. Her bio is on our website at peacecoalition.org. Take a look if you want to know more, but I think most of you know her through her Nuns on the Bus leadership. She was one of the key leaders of that project. I think it was fantastic. And as I said, when I introduced her this morning at our annual multi-faith service for peace, it was a great example of walking the walk and not just talking the talk. So Sister Simone, take it away.
Oh, thank you so much, Bob. It's an honor to be with you all. And I'm really excited for this opportunity, even though it is Zoom land and we miss being physically present. We're hoping that I can give about 20-minute presentation and then have 10 minutes for question and answer engagement. Now, what would help me is if you've got a question as I'm going along, put it in the chat, and then I'll field those questions towards the end, okay? Now, we only want, socially appropriate, peaceful questions, but whatever strikes you, please feel free to add it, okay? Great. Well, it really is a really important time to gather for the engagement with peace building in our nation. And I was really struck by this because in October, I spent 2 weeks at one of the military bases with the what we were all calling the Afghan guests, those who fled Afghanistan under the most frightening, horrific experiences. And here are these families caught in limbo, trying to begin to make some sense of their future. Many were very sad to have left their country. Many had invested a lot in trying to make Afghanistan work. And I remember this one man who led a military platoon. He was out in the Kandahar province, and he said, someone I was with asked him, well, what happened? Why did you leave? He said, I was a leader of men, but when the Taliban came, all of my men left and I had no one left to lead. And so his choice was either to face punishment from the Taliban or flee with his family. And his account of trying to get his family and get out of Afghanistan was fairly horrifying and horrific. But I was so touched by the fact that if you don't have someone to lead, then we're left alone. And so as we look at our peace building efforts, it becomes critically important that we look at who do we lead? How are we involved? How are we building a community to enhance our work for peace? And this time, there's, I mean, the speakers that you're going to have this afternoon is fabulous. What with Professor Goldston, Richard Moody, I mean, they're going to talk about the physical reality of what's happening with nuclear weapons, with war, and how we need to dismantle that. I want to take a slightly different stance and talk about the impact on our nation, the personal impact on our nation, and the challenges that we're facing because of an orientation towards war and not peace, and what we can do because of it. This past week in the Washington Post, some of you may have seen it, it was reported about a veteran who ended up successfully committing suicide by the Lincoln Memorial. And that was the week before. And it caused the Post to do more of a investigation into suicide by veterans. And the report said that 61,000 veterans have committed suicide in the 21 years of this century. 61,000. And I think when we look at the consequences of war, too often we leave out the personal consequences of the men and women who have done what their nation asked, maybe misguided, but what the nation asked, and yet find themselves so lost in the process that they cannot bear to continue to live. It's this piece that I think is maybe a way into shifting the obsession that our nation can at times have with military prowess, as if machines could keep us safe. The challenge is that we try, those of peace activists, we try to spread the word. We try to spread the concept of peace. We try to engage our fellow citizens and make a difference, shift public policy. We've been working at this for a really long time. And I remember in advance of the Iraq War, demonstrating in San Francisco, marching in the streets, you know, doing the old Vietnam protest songs because we didn't have new music, but how critically it was to take to the streets. But you know, in Network, the organization that I led until just this spring, we did a series of rural roundtables around the country, trying to learn about the reality of rural communities. Because I have to say, I was sort of judgmental about how city folk would show up, but where are the country folk? Where are folks who have different perspectives? How do we find a way forward together? And we were outside Columbia, Missouri, and I'll never forget this one woman said to me, because I was talking about a protest I'd been at, and she said to me, wow, you know, in the city, you go to a protest and there's no consequences. You're anonymous. And I thought, whoa, I'd never thought about that. And she said, if we go to a protest here in a small town, we're known. There are consequences. And then she added, we're not conservative. We're just careful of our relationships. And it has led me to wonder, how can we be careful of our relationships? What does it take to be able to build a community that's respectful enough where my position, your position, but other positions are treated with equal dignity and equal support? And I think it is that challenge that we face in our polarized time that it is very difficult to see that there is that the variety, the perspectives that we have a different, all of them have some legitimacy if we listen long enough to each other. Now, I will say, I know I'm right. I can't imagine anybody else in this crowd holds that position, but I'm sure you would all agree with me. I'm absolutely right. And the challenge is to open my mind to another point of view, to trying to see it from a different perspective. And so one of the pieces that I find very helpful in peace building is actually, well, I'm a Catholic sister, so you probably won't be surprised who I'm going to cite here, but is Pope Francis. In one of his early writings as Pope, he did this whole thing about 4 aspects of what we need to build peace. And his first perspective, he says, is time is greater than space. Well, I've been watching one of those NOVA programs that's on right now about space, time, and the galaxies and all this. And oh man, I don't quite understand all of it, but I don't think that's what Pope Francis had in mind, was the galaxies. I think rather what he's talking about is so often that it's more important to think, I've got time for a relationship. I've got time for an exchange. And often when I'm talking to someone who thinks differently than I do, I'm about some bill that's up in Congress, we got to get it done, and it's really a short time. And so I don't have time to listen to your harebrained schemes and to why you're wrong. I just want you to vote on this bill. And what Pope Francis is saying, no, we get that all wrong. We get too focused, too close to us. Rather, what we have to look at is that if we want peace, we've got to be able to build a peace that is inclusive of various spaces. Make some sense? And so that if we're going to build a peace that's inclusive of various spaces, we need to take time. What comes to my head right now is the story of Lebanon. I don't know if you know this, but Lebanon's divided by their administration, which is why it's falling apart, is divided by a census that was taken in 1960, at which time there was a third Christian, a third Sunni, a third Shia. And so they divided up the government responsibilities among those 3 religious factions. Life has changed dramatically in Lebanon. But because they've got the space of this one marker and the division of power based on this census, they're fractured and unable. And so Pope Francis would call them to talk to each other and make sure that everyone is engaged now in the conversation. Open the time frame. Don't keep it locked in the 60. Open it up and welcome people in and find a new way forward if we really want peace. And I suppose the question would be asked, do they really want peace? Or do they want to just preserve the power dynamic that exists currently? We could say the same thing in the United States, but we'll get to that part. The second thing Pope Francis says, and I get myself really encouraged by this, is he says that, in the long run, the hunger for unity prevails over conflict. people get tired of fighting. Well, I take heart by that. And I know that my hunger to be connected is much deeper and stronger than my desire to be right. But let me give you an example of that. Okay, so for years I went around the country talking about my relatives and how it can be challenging. And I talked about my brother. My brother's the youngest and I'm the oldest in the family. And, you know, we'd have those kinds of fights. And he just likes to fight with me because I'm the oldest and he's the youngest and he's got to make his points. Well, it's now about 4 years ago when I was on a bus, one of our nuns on the bus trips. And one of the videos that I did went really viral and it was all over the internet. And it was every place. Well, apparently his Facebook friends started attacking, or some of his friends started attacking me. And then my sister saw that he had defended me. He not only defended me, but he said he was going to stand up for his friend and his sister. That changed my heart. I realized that I hungered for unity with him, that I really didn't want to have this fight, that the fight we were having was sort of more ritual than it really was connection. And so I think us peace activists, we've got to hunger for unity and find ways to connect. The third point Pope Francis makes is realities are more important than ideas or theories. Realities are more important than theories. And the way I've come to understand that is, you know, you can have a theory about peace building and you can go on and on. And when I used to lobby Paul Ryan in Congress, he always had a theory about about the budget and how it was all going to work and it would just be fine. But what I discovered is when I would tell him a story, a reality of someone who would be adversely impacted by his glorious theories, he had a really hard time. I'll never forget this one time telling the story of Billy and his wife and how they were going to be knocked off food stamps because of Paul Ryan's perspective. And both Billy and his wife were working, trying to support themselves and their 2 kids. And this was going to be devastating. And what did Paul Ryan say to me? Paul Ryan says, well, they're not the targets of my program. And my response, no, but they're going to be the victims. And it was his coming to see that while he had this great theory, that the victimization of people he did not intend to suffer at all, the actual names of people affected him. So I think for us as peace activists, the more we can ground our work in the stories of real people, the stories of real struggle, the better off we are. So realities are more important than theories. You can have a lot of theories. They're great theories. I love theories. They're fun because there's no consequences to them. But reality is important. And finally, Pope Francis says, the whole is greater than the parts. Now we all knew that. There's nothing new there. But what he says is, if you're missing a part, you don't have a whole, a W-H-O-L-E. You have an H-O-L-E. You have an absence. And so that the challenge is when we're trying to build peace is who else do we need at the table? Who's missing from being able to create the peace that we hunger for? How do we as peace activists include others in our circles of conversation? That is the challenge that we face, is to be able to take the time to have conversation across the space, to hunger for unity in a way that I really want to understand the other, that we talk about realities as opposed to my explanation of a theory, and that we get everybody involved. This is the challenge of our time, because we are so divided as a nation. We've got so many theories that separate us. We have, false facts, we have, all sorts of internet foolishness. But the fact is that we need to be the leaders we've been waiting for to move forward in relationship to create an opportunity for peace that will transcend the militarization, the divisiveness, and the hardship that our people are enduring. And that way, maybe we will indeed be able to help create, not be the sole creators, not be the ones in charge, but we might be able to help create community that can nurture the imagination that can move us into peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Simone. Yes, let's show our appreciation. Wow, a lot of challenging thoughts and ideas there. I know it expands my horizons. And Sister Simone, you can see in the chat box, 2 people have presented questions so far. Now,
I've got it here. Let me just get it up. There was an early, let me use the.
Yeah, Larry Holman has 3, so let's just take one of his 3, and then my daughter Dorothy Anna Moore has a question. So why don't you start?
Well, all right. Well, we'll do the first one of Larry's, then we'll do Dorothy's, and then if we got more time, we can do that. Okay. So Larry's first question is, how do we get those who nurture their greed, anger, and ignorance, and thereby become powerful to change their inner selves, to join the efforts towards peace, service to humanity, and Mother Earth? Okay, with questions like this, what I say is the Affordable Care Act needs to include brain transplants. I mean, that's just it. That's what we have to do. So, but apart from brain transplants, one of the challenges for us activists is that we always start with our imagination at the worst possible scenario. The head of Raytheon, or we start at the worst possible place. As opposed to, if you think about bridge building, if we're going to build bridges to that worst possible place, what you do is you've got your pillar set. 2 pillars are set. We've got the horrible, awful place. We've got us who are anchored, and you build out across. So we have to think of moving gradually to get more people to see and engage, but we also need to be changed in how we talk about this, because I'll bet you going to the president of Raytheon and saying to them, I want to stop your greed, anger, and ignorance. I don't think that's going to be a very good talking point to get you in or to make change. So what we have to do is create relationships that are strong enough that eventually reach out to those folks and be able to make a connection and shift hearts. Because it is mind and hearts. And then we can send them a videotape or send them the connection to the link of this recording, and I'm sure they'll see the light. But the challenge is relationship. Is we've got to build it in relationship. Okay, does that make sense?
Dorothy, can you do Dorothy? And then I see Ed Aguilar also has a question. So why don't you try to do those 2?
Dorothy says, are we faced with the necessity to compromise matters of rights, etc.? At what point can we not compromise, and what should we do in that case? Oh, that is such a good question. And really, that is the moral challenge of our time. For me, this comes up so often, especially in regards to racial justice and the structural racism that exists in our society, and how do we move forward in a way where I feel like every move I make echoes with structural racism. And for myself, okay, I'm a Catholic sister, so I'm going to say this. I have a prayer practice of just trying to listen to where I'm called to move next, and to do it in relationship. Relationship, the key to this thing, not individualism. And so while I can mess up and make choices where I sell short the the goals, at least we will have moved forward, or my heart will have moved forward. The ending of the climate conference in Glasgow is a perfect example of going as far as we can, and then being ready to take the next step. But we will never arrive. That's the secret of this work, is we will never arrive. And to know that we're always on the road. Now, the good news of that is it means I can always grow and learn. The bad news is I really would like to arrive. I would like to succeed. I'd like my tombstone to say, and that she built peace. It's not happening. But isn't the process glorious? Isn't it great we can be community together? That we can struggle with this? Wouldn't it be boring if we said after the Vietnam era, well, mission accomplished, did that, took care of that. Then what would we do? We'd be bored. So part of this is all about the effort to make a more perfect union. It's always going to be in that effort. So as we can go as far as we can go, but do it in relationship, and then know that there'll be a next step. So I don't have to get it all in this one bite. That's my advice.
Thank you,
Okay, I
Sister
see.
Simone. And I see there's two last questions. If you could just touch, fairly briefly on each of them, one from Ed Aguilar and the other from Kip Cherry.
Okay. All right, Ed, the reality of the global South, and many here, is suffering from the climate crisis. Absolutely. How do we get the world leaders to focus on the suffering? Well, I think that there's been a fair amount of good work done by those nations, especially the island nations. The Pacific Islanders have done some really good work at lifting up these issues. My hunch is, though, self-interest has a tendency to move hearts as opposed to the lamentation for others, compassion for others. They're in my lobbying of members of Congress, it's very easy for them to deflect the story from outside the US. Well, that's their country leaders that need to do this. They don't feel the same compulsion. And so since self-interest governs, I think to make, especially on climate, to make it as personal and as direct and as engaged as possible. And since most of you are in this New Jersey area, I mean, Hurricane Sandy was a great example that began to wake up some of the New Jersey delegation, to say nothing of the New York delegation, that we need to address this issue of climate change. Now they forget and they say, oh, it wasn't connected. But we just have to keep telling the stories over and over. In my experience, politicians don't change their hearts for somebody not in their district. They're self-interested. But where that does make a difference is in our congregations and communities, in just educating people about the impact on the world. And in that way, non-political actors, then in that way, I think we can build a bigger movement. That's helpful. And last, thank you for calling, Manisha called me wise, thank you. Okay, Kip, can you expand on your concept of being connected? So many people in our culture really don't feel connected. Oh, that includes returning military. Oh, the returning military is so true, my nephew included. The thing is I think we need to develop the sacred art of listening and being curious. This morning I spoke about holy curiosity and our responsibility to be curious about others. And what I've found going around the country is being curious about somebody else, it draws them in a whole different way, and gets people to talk about themselves. I mentioned the rural roundtables that we did, and people were so surprised that we came to listen. They thought we came to, speak at them. No, talk to me about this. Or you can do it like if you're going to the grocery store in person, or any place. We don't do it so often right now in COVID, but any place where you stand in line, you can say to the person in front of you, behind you, gee, I've been concerned about X, Y, or Z. I'm concerned about what's happening in our community. Or have you been in our community long? Do you live around here? Or anything that's curious can create connections. And it's that we need to break through. We have to be like the folks in rural Missouri, where we're so connected that there are consequences for what we believe. That when we show up, it matters, that we're not anonymous. So I urge you, peace activists. All right, you got New Jersey covered. Go for it. Be engaged. Do it. We need you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Simone. We really appreciate that. Spectacular presentation, very good Q&A period as well. And your ride is waiting right outside the door, Sister Simone, but don't turn off that computer, because Patricia, who had internet problems at home, our assistant director, is going to replace you right at the seat you're going to vacate. So have a safe trip home, and thank you so much for being with us today, both for the multi-faith service and for this conference.
Well, thank you all. Keep up the great work. We need you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thanks. So as that other screen transitions a little bit with Patricia is about to take that seat, and it'll be great to have her help in managing this event. I'd like to move on to our next speaker. We're running almost right on schedule, by the way, so I think that's good news. And I'm honored to introduce Professor Rob Goldston. His bio is also on our website, but let me just very succinctly say he is a world-class physicist, and he has been a great person on so many of our issues, the Iran nuclear agreement, which tragically didn't last, but now he's written an article in the most recent edition of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists about averting a new nuclear arms race, and that is the title of his talk. So Professor Goldston, take it away.
Little luck, you see my screen. So I'm affiliated faculty with the Program on Science and Global Security at Princeton, and here we are at the Coalition for Peace Action. And we just heard a wonderful talk. I'm almost like, well, maybe what we should just do is have 20 minutes of silence and appreciate what Sister Simone said. But you're stuck with me, and so we're going to talk about averting the coming arms race, because it's coming. I mean, you could even say averting the present arms race. So I'm going to talk about 4 different things and try to get through them pretty succinctly, and then you can ask questions, and we can get at the specifics or more general, however you want to go. So one is limiting ballistic missile defense. I'm going to claim this is a terrible issue that we have created. I'm going to talk about eliminating silo-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, that are sitting ducks and just asking for someone to shoot at them. I'm going to talk about the Intermediate Range Nuclear Armed Forces Treaty that Reagan signed and that we have gotten out of and that we need to get into, but perhaps in a somewhat different way. And then I'll talk a little bit about nuclear declaratory policy as a way to turn down the temperature. So 4 things. And you can look at this article if you just search for Goldston, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, you'll find it. Okay, so we are leading the way in a new arms race. We've long ago declared that we were going to have a brand new replacement for all of our intercontinental ballistic missiles. What we haven't stressed is the fact that they will have additional capabilities. It has more throw weight. It can have probably more warheads. It almost certainly has a longer range. So this ground-based strategic deterrent that's supposed to replace our ICBMs is an escalation. We're putting out new submarines called SSBNs and boomers. These will be quieter, they'll be bigger. That probably won't handle more missiles, but they might handle more warheads. And so while these are stabilizing, because they're very hard to find and everybody kind of knows that if you start a war, you're going to be facing these things, they certainly are an escalation. We're also replacing our old bombers. I mean, some of them are B-52s that go way back with these stealth bombers that put us in a position using particularly these long-range standoff cruise missiles to cause havoc, and possibly because these things are so stealthy, by surprise. So we are instigating an arms race. And this is the part that is even worse. In 2002, the US withdrew from the 1972 Nixon-era anti-ballistic missile treaty. So we all know that George W. Bush got us into Iraq, and that was a terrible mistake. Arguably, this was even worse, getting out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And so we'll get into this in a little bit of detail. So the ground-based mid-course defense, which is over here on the left, you can see one of them being launched. They've tried 19 times to knock down ICBM-like targets, very scripted situations, very simplified, typically only one thing to hit, as if the other guy was only going to throw one rocket at you. And still they only got 12 out of 19. There are 44, pardon me, of these ground-based mid-course defense missiles deployed. I think people should mute themselves. One set are in Arkansas, in Alaska, one set are in California. And so you say, well, 44, if the other guy has a few hundred, maybe North Korea has less than 44, but China certainly has more. So China shouldn't worry about this. Why is everybody worried about this? Why is this causing China and Russia to do a buildup? And it's because of something that doesn't get as much press. There's a thing called Aegis ships. Aegis was Zeus's shield. So, the United States is Zeus, we're the top god, and we have this wonderful shield. They've been a little more successful, 35 successes in 44 tests that were outside the atmosphere. And they did in 2020, November 2020, as directed by Congress, shoot down an ICBM. By 2025, we're planning to have 65 of these ships. And the breathtaking fact is that each one has up to about 100 launchers. Now, it's going to need to have launchers for self-defense and for local defense and so on. But say half of them were against ICBMs. That's 3,000 anti-ballistic missiles. And so if you're China with a few hundred, or you're Russia with a few thousand, at most, actually 1,500 according to the current treaty, you think this is going to be a reason you're going to have to build more nuclear weapons because they think this might work. So this has happened before. Reagan committed to the Strategic Defense Initiative and just couldn't give it up, even though everybody knew it would not work. He just couldn't give it up. Gorbachev said, just keep it in the laboratory, and he couldn't say that. And so they almost got to the point of banning nuclear weapons. They were really close, and Reagan couldn't give up the Strategic Defense Initiative. So it's the same problem. And our withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty motivated new delivery systems by Russia and China. And if you want, I can show you some scary slides about this, but the gist of it is Russia and China, as a result of this, are building up their capabilities. So this is the worst of all possible worlds. You can't imagine something worse from the point of view of the stability of arms control. The US can't trust that these things will ever work. They haven't worked. They've worked half the time against scripted targets, and nobody's gonna hand us the script. And Russia and China are developing new delivery systems to avoid our ballistic missile defense stuff. They're doing crazy stuff. They're coming up with nuclear-powered cruise missiles that can go over the South Pole so that our ballistic missile defense is all oriented towards the north, because that's where their ICBMs will come from, and also their sea-launched ballistic missiles. So we're kind of setting up the other guy to have to build more stuff. Russia and China can't trust, on the other hand, that this will never work. See, we don't know if it will ever work, and they don't know that it will never work, particularly as we improve and expand it. Suppose we do put out 3,000 launchers that can take out ICBMs. So this is a formula for a spiraling arms race. They will build, after the New START treaty is over in 5 years, Russia will, if we don't back down on this stuff, will build many, many more missiles headed our way. And then our guys will be like, oh, if they've got 5,000 warheads headed our way, we have to have 5,000. So we're just setting ourselves up for a world-destroying situation. And a little subtle point that people don't get is that if we have missile defenses, so we're ready to knock 500 of these out of the sky, let's say, and the other guy doesn't have missile defenses anywhere near as strong, then cutting down together on the number of warheads, the other guy isn't going to be willing to do that. That disadvantages him tremendously. If he cuts down to 500, maybe we can just knock all of them out of the sky. So, and even reductions in the ability to launch decoys, penetration aids they're called, that's something nobody can do if the other side has all of these missile defenses. So in this situation, according to the African American spiritual, you got to lay down your sword and shield. If we keep having bigger shields, they're going to need to have more swords. So we need to provide Russia and China with verifiable assurance. They got to be able to come and look that we will never attempt to have a disarming first strike capability against them. So this is really tough. But if we can't provide them with that assurance, they're just going to have to build more stuff to attack us because they can't afford these complicated and actually don't work ballistic missile defenses. They can't be confident they would work. And the place this drives us to is that if another country suspects that we can disarm them, we can knock out a lot of their stuff with a first strike, and then with a ragged, what's left, sometimes called a ragged response, we can blow those out of the sky with our ballistic missile defense. Then at any moment of crisis, they realize that they are in such danger that they have to strike first. So this is a crazy world that we're walking into and that George W. Bush set us up for. And the Russians are begging us to talk about missile defense when we talk about strategic stability with them. And we need to do it. So onto ICBMs, they're sitting ducks. You can look on Wikipedia and get the coordinates, and then you can go to Google Maps and there's one. That's the coordinate from Wikipedia. There it is, there's the silo. So all the way back in 1981, we were looking for where to put what are called the MX missiles, which were crazy 10 warhead, really dangerous missiles. Don't go to there's a place near the airport in Albuquerque where they have all these things on display, and it just makes your blood run cold to see these things. They ultimately set them up for launch under attack so that if missiles were coming in, you could launch them. But the review of this said there would always remain the possibility of error. Depending on the nature of the error, it could mean that the Soviets would take out these MXs, or it could mean that we had started a nuclear war by accident. Holy cow. This is what we have 400 of. So I argue that these missiles in silos are either useless or worse than useless. Unless they're set for launch under attack, they're useless. They'd just be destroyed. They're sitting ducks. If I can find them on Wikipedia and Google Maps, the Russian army can. But on launch under attack, they're worse than useless because they could be fired in error. A false alarm, let's say a third party does a little cyber intrusion and gets us into a war with China or gets us into a war with Russia. Sounds like a movie, but it also sounds like something pretty close to reality these days. It's just the fact that in either a conventional or a non-strategic nuclear war, maybe we're for some reason using rather theater nuclear weapons. They've attacked Latvia. I don't know. We had a non-first use policy, but they used first. In that confusion, we could end up launching a war that destroys humanity. And And I'd argue they're not useful for deterrence either. If we just have one submarine survive, we have enough nuclear weapons to devastate the other side's civilization utterly. The living would envy the dead. We destroy their hospitals, we destroy their ability, their whole medical system, we destroy their ability to have agriculture. We'd ultimately, if enough of these were launched, we'd destroy the whole world's ability to do agriculture for a decade. So you don't need these things for deterrence if we have just a few submarines survive. And they're useless for what's called war fighting. The other side would likely attack them first. They're obvious targets. So we'd have to fire them right at the start. There's no war fighting involved. It's just destruction. And so I could go through all the numbers and the details, but Russia and the US each have about 400 warheads on these silo-based use them or lose them ICBMs. So we should just get rid of them ourselves alone, or in a deal with the Russians. Or if somebody doesn't want to give up these crazy warheads, we could move them to submarines and bombers. But let's get them away from this situation where it's under hair trigger alert. Okay, moving right along. What about intermediate range nuclear armed forces? So the greatest threat to Europe in the 80s was these intermediate range Soviet SS-20 missiles. Each had 3 warheads. And they could rapidly decapitate the leadership in Paris or London because they were so nearby. So we began to install nuclear-armed Pershing II intermediate range missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles in Europe. And this was a huge escalation because now we could decapitate the place that really had a lot of nuclear capability, much more so than France or Britain. We could decapitate Moscow very quickly. And Reagan was willing to make a deal on this international, intermediate range nuclear forces treaty in '88. And here we are with doverye no proverye, trust but verify. Apparently Gorbachev thought Reagan had such an awful Russian accent that he said, stop saying this, stop. But Reagan loved it, so he keeps saying it over and over again. And what Gorbachev said that was actually pretty wise was, there's another Russian proverb, if there are enough guns around, they'll start firing on their own, meaning that nobody would be responsible, but a lot of people will be killed. So they signed that thing, but we pulled out in 2019, 30 years later, due to Russian violations. They were violating it, not with nuclear armed missiles, but they were violating it. And Russia claimed that our Aegis, we have the same Aegis ships we have one sort of ashore, but still run by the Navy in Romania. And it could have launched cruise missiles at Russia. And so Russia said that was a violation too. So my proposal is, we can't get back to that original thing, but let's ban land-based nuclear armed. This actually also banned non-nuclear missiles. Short intermediate range missiles in Europe, west of the Urals, which is actually pretty far away from Moscow, pretty far to the east from Moscow. And so it would get rid of this very short range problem. And we should do it the same in Asia.
You hear that?
But only nuclear missiles. It's impossible to deal with conventional missiles this way. So find these land-based missiles by national technical means, and you can check whether they have neutrons, whether they're therefore nuclear missiles. So we could back away from this very fast timescale problem if we made a deal here, which is a problem that it drives people again to have more and more systems, because you want to be sure the other guy can decapitate you. You want to be sure you can decapitate them. It's just crazy. So last topic is nuclear declaratory policy. We're moving through a lot of stuff here. The very best version of what we say, what we declare about what we would do with nuclear weapons would be to sign on to the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Because if there are no nuclear weapons, there can't be a nuclear war. But if we're in the phase of this negotiating with Russia, they're worried that the NATO forces are superior to theirs. And so, nuclear weapons are the poor man's self-defense. So that's a problem. The next best thing is no first use. If no one goes first, there can be no nuclear war, right? And we should be working on this now with our allies. Our allies are nervous about this, but this should be a priority of what we work on. We need to convince Poland, Latvia, Japan, South Korea that even a foreign invasion that was successful and overrun their country, even such an invasion, followed by a NATO or an allied, if you like, conventional counterattack that is successful, that's way better than a nuclear war on their soil. They shouldn't want us to start a nuclear war on their soil. So what we need to do is assure them that adequate conventional forces will be available and will be used if needed in their defense. That is a big lift, but that's got to be our policy, and that's something we have to do more. But probably this no first use is a non-starter for the same reasons with the Russians. The Chinese have said it before, and maybe we could get them to say it again. Maybe we could have a no first use policy bilaterally with China, which would be a great thing. That just turns down the temperature. Another possibility, if you back down, it would be much better to have the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It would be better to have no first use. But in 1992, McGeorge Bundy, William Crowe, Sidney Drell, a diplomat, a military guy, and a physicist, came up with this idea of defensive last resort. It's a last resort, it's defensive, and it's only in case of an imminent existential threat. And so I actually published something about this too, with this same idea. And it's actually pretty close to existing Russian policy for possible use of nuclear weapons. They've been very explicit. And there's a bunch of details, but it sort of could be summarized as aggression against the Russian Federation with the use of conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is in jeopardy. That would be a case where they would consider using nuclear weapons. So that's pretty close to this imminent existential threat policy. It's not as good as no first use. I want to say that again. It's not as good as the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but it's better than where we stand now. And maybe we could get a deal on that with Russia. So we're at a fork in the road. One path forward leads to a safer world if we can make some deals with these guys that turn down the temperature, that back off from this arms race. We could maybe eventually get to a world free of nuclear weapons. And the other path forward, where we keep building up defenses, they keep building up offenses, we ultimately have to build up offenses. That's a rapidly increasing risk of nuclear annihilation. And so 4 thoughts that might avert this coming arms race with Russia and China would be to limit ballistic missile defense. I think that's just so important. Eliminate these crazy silo-based intercontinental ballistic missiles that you got to launch them on warning, and who knows whether you've got a mistaken warning. It would be great to prohibit these very fast intermediate range nuclear armed forces that can decapitate the other side, force them again to act too quickly. And we should adopt a more restrictive nuclear declaratory policy so that the other side knows that it's not going to be the case that we will use these things offensively, or even we would use them in some kind of local war that wasn't an existential risk to ourselves or our allies. So that's my stuff.
Thank you very much, Professor Goldston. I think that was excellent and very informative, very understanding. And as I told you when I read your article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, I think it's a really nice synthesis between the pragmatic and the possible. So I think your approach could indeed make us a much safer world, and ultimately on the way to the abolition of nuclear weapons for everyone. But in the short term, it would really be, the world would be way, way safer if we took the measures that you have described. So we very much appreciate that. I see in the chat box, and Professor Goldston, if you could just scroll down, take a look. I had the first 4 people. I don't think we'll be able to get much past that. So let's take those in order, if you would. My daughter, Dorothy Moore, Larry Holman, Kip Cherry, and Rob Chellery. So if you could just give at least brief comments on each of their 4 questions, I think we'll be at the end of our half hour for you at that point.
Okay, so Dorothy Moore asked, are we faced with the necessity to compromise? No, that's earlier. I see. So how do I find Dorothy Moore again? know what, if you've got these right in front of you, why don't you read them to me, Bob? Oh, nuclear weapons are horrible and should be eliminated, you bet.
There you go. Mhm.
But should activists be approaching this through an anti-nuke standpoint directly, or should we emphasize ending violent conflicts in general? Would that decision affect the political response? I guess, so that's a good question. Or at least it's, it might be that it's a false dichotomy in the sense that we should back away from nuclear weapons. We should be using the military solely in a defensive form. We should stop doing crazy stuff, you know, as Barack Obama said, don't do stupid. And we've been doing stupid and violent, you know, and yeah, I think these are both important things, I guess, is the answer. Would be my answer. You know, the problem with nuclear weapons is they can so suddenly, you know, just when we don't know it's coming, it could come around behind us and just basically destroy everything we built in the last 5,000 years. And so then, Larry, would we be better off if we just unilaterally surrendered to any potential aggressors and hope our population gets treated with respect? And then Larry asks again, how is it anyone's interest other than the military industrial constantly in competition for power and domination over neighbor nations? You know, I think, what do I think? Unilaterally surrender to any potential aggressors. Gosh, you know, I think the, well, you know, it's an easy way out of trying to having to answer that question for myself is to say that I think it would be very hard for political leaders to take that point of view. Certainly, that was a mistake in Munich before World War II. Insofar as that was really, was that a surrender? But it was, you know, there's a problem there. So I think there are cases where we need to either defend ourselves or our allies, or, you know, there is also this question of when there is things going on in another country that are so violent against their population, do we have an obligation to protect? Absolutely, there's no, the trick, we certainly don't want to be in competition for power and domination over other nations. The trick here is to figure out that, you know, in our relationship with China, it has been to our advantage. You know, things are less expensive here, and we have, it's the biggest anti-poverty program that's ever happened in the entire history of the world, what happened in China over the last 30 years. And I don't think we think that's a bad thing. I think we think that's a good thing. And we need to, in trade with them, you know, what the way this has to work is that it's to their country's advantage, it's to our country's advantage, and we have to do the things internally so that it's not to the tremendous disadvantage of our blue collar workers, that, you know, they get underbid by Chinese blue collar workers. And so we need to restructure our economy so that they don't get disadvantaged by this. So it's okay to be in an economic competition or synergy, but we have to be extremely careful what it does to our own population. And that means we have to do things. Okay, so Kip, do you think if we move to get rid of our land-based missiles, Russia would be willing to reciprocate? Yeah, so that's an interesting question. The Russians really have a dependence on these very big, heavy ICBMs, partly because they want to be able to get the decoy, a lot of decoys on them. So there's no deal going to be made with Russia if we don't limit ballistic missile defense. It's possible you could make a deal if we did, and they've said it. They've said what we need to talk about is, and it even says it in the New START Treaty, we need to talk about both defensive and offensive weapons. Yeah, and China is moving forward with these land-based missiles with a bunch of them. Yes, absolutely. I've got these pictures in the more complete version of this talk. I think there's a possibility, actually, that we could say we're not doing silo-based missiles and we're limiting ballistic missile defense, so you don't need these things. And the expensive part isn't digging the hole. The expensive part is filling it with a missile with particularly with warheads on it. And so we could maybe get to a deal, and this is like the time to do it with China. So I think there's a possibility. It's a little tricky because can you sell the same camel both to the Chinese and to the Russians? And I think the answer is yes. I think if we get rid of these hair trigger based missiles, and we make a deal on ballistic missile defense, that should be good enough for both of them. We can actually sell that camel to both of them. Okay, so that was 3. Is that what you wanted, Bob?
Yes, thank you very much. We really appreciate that. And I do think, as your last point illustrated and Kip's question illustrated, there is a way of moving forward on this that's short of complete unilateral disarmament by one side or another, and that is unilateral initiatives. And so that has worked on things like the Partial Test Ban Treaty, where President Kennedy initiated that and challenged the then Soviet Union to reciprocate. And similarly, in reverse, for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the Soviets were the first to stop and the US reciprocated. So I think there is a good reason to believe that those kinds of dramatic unilateral initiatives can in fact get the dynamic change. So thank you very much.
Well, the big example of that is George H.W. Bush.
Yes.
Who tremendously cut back on our nuclear capabilities, and Yeltsin did a reciprocal, what they call presidential nuclear initiative, and that was a huge cutback in both cases. Yeah.
Yes, he actually eliminated more U.S. nuclear weapons than any other president. And that's because he was willing to do those kinds of, and we're nonpartisan, as you well know. We like it when whatever party you are, if you're doing the right thing to move us in the right direction, that we're very happy about that. So again, let's show our appreciation to Professor Goldston. Fantastic presentation, and I know Professor Goldston is going to be giving that presentation and has a number of invitations elsewhere in the country. So his article in the bulletin has, I think, sparked some very good interest and response, and we'll be partnering with Professor Goldston as much as we possibly can. So now I am pleased to introduce our final speaker, and that is Richard Moody. Richard is a former fighter pilot and Top Gun instructor, and some years ago he saw the light and felt a transformation happening. And he is now an ardent peace activist and a practicing Quaker. And so we're very pleased. Richard has just completed, it's not yet out in regular print, he only has a preprint version of his autobiography, Flying Through Life. So Richard, take it away. You got to unmute, Richard.
Yes, unmute.
I'm unmuted now. Bob,
Yeah.
I'm not reading, I'm on this iPad and I'm not seeing any chat. So when there are questions, could you ask them to me?
Sure.
Ask me?
Yep.
Yeah, because I'm not there.
Sure.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Bob. And perhaps I can show the front cover of the book. It is in the publishing stage, probably won't be out much before Christmas. There's a few bits of fine tuning that need to be done. But it is called Flying Through Life, From Fighter Pilot to Peace Activist. And the bottom left is of the front cover is a peace symbol, and the bottom right is the peace dove with a laurel leaf in its beak. And I'd just like to sort of go through my previous life before I saw the light and became an ardent peace. So I was born in England in the county of Hampshire during World War II. And so we did experience German bombing raids over the house and the V-1 Doodlebug coming over, etc. And I come from a quasi-religious military family, in that my grandfather was a Church of England vicar in 2 country parishes in England, in Hampshire and Surrey. And my father was a career naval officer. And he, in fact, it's hard to believe, but he actually fought in the First World War, the Great War as it was originally called, at the Battle of Jutland, and also in the Dardanelles campaign. And I think the Dardanelles campaign, what he did was perhaps had an influence on me becoming an aviator, a military aviator, a naval aviator. because he spent some of the time sitting in a basket hanging below a very large tethered balloon, which was tethered to a naval ship. And he had binoculars and a radio, and he reported on the Turkish trenches and controlled the naval guns. But then he spent time in the back of an Henri Farman biplane with the Royal Naval Air Service, which was founded about 3 years before the Dardanelles. And he was there flying all over the place, reporting on the position of the Turkish trenches. And he then went on to be an aircraft carrier captain. He rose to admiral. He was in charge of all naval aviation in the UK during World War II and became C&C East Indies Fleet and was knighted. So I guess there was sort of flying in the blood. And I grew up my initial years in South Africa because my father became Commander-in-Chief South Atlantic and South America Station. And so I went to school outside Cape Town. We were down in a town called Simonstown. And then I went to two private boarding schools, believe it or not, from the age of 8 in England. And I got a scholarship to the Naval College, Britannia Royal Naval College, Dartmouth, which is the equivalent of Annapolis. And when I got my commission, I did 2 seagoing jobs before I did my flying training. And the first seagoing job was in the Fishery Protection Squadron, which is the oldest squadron in the Royal Navy. Admiral Lord Nelson served in it as a junior officer. And our job was really a nautical gamekeeper, patrolling the waters of the British Isles and stopping the foreign trawlers from poaching inside the 3-mile limit. I then got selected to serve on Her Majesty the Queen's Royal Yacht, and we actually circumnavigated the world and took the royal family, Her Majesty the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, on royal tours of Fiji, Australia, and New Zealand. And I was the meteorologist, so I had to give a weather forecast to the Queen each morning, which was fairly intimidating. And I was also the celestial navigator, doing all the navigation across the oceans in the days before GPS and satellite nav using a sextant. Then I did my flying training in Yorkshire on an airplane called the Jet Provost. It was a jet aircraft. I never flew a piston until right at the end of my flying career. And then I did my advanced flying training on a Hawker Hunter in Wales. I then did two-year each carrier tours, flying the Fairey Gannet and the de Havilland Sea Vixen fighters, an aircraft you've probably never heard of, which were in the British infantry. And that was all east of Suez in the days when we had a bit of a British Empire, and Singapore, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Japan, India, etc., etc. And from there, I was then asked to join the US Navy, well, not join it, but be seconded to it. And I operated in a Phantom squadron out of Navy Miramar. As Bob said, I just happened to be around at the time when Top Gun was founded in 1969. And I was asked to become a member of the staff. And I flew the A4E Skyhawk, which was an aircraft with a similar performance to the MiGs during the Vietnam era. And we used that to train other pilots in fighter combat. But I was also the ordnance officer. And that meant I was responsible for all the ghastly weaponry we had, including 250-pound bombs, 500-pound bombs, napalm, etc. And I was responsible for training all these pilots in dropping these ghastly pieces of ordnance into ranges in the deserts, mainly in Arizona. Thank goodness I was never sent to drop bombs and kill people in Vietnam, because I don't think I could live with it if I had done it now. But because I was a Brit, I'm now a Brit and an American. But I did deliver a fighter across the Pacific with in-flight refueling and stops in Hawaii and Wake Island to Japan. And I was very aware of what was going on. But the horrible thing is, looking back on it, I think one's totally brainwashed in the military. There's the Uniform Code of Military Justice. There's the seniority ranking system. You don't question orders. And none of us in the squadron ever questioned what we were doing. Of course, there is tremendous comradeship on an aircraft carrier or in fighter squadrons ashore. You're all looking after each other. It's all very dangerous work. And I came away from my time with the US Navy really not understanding what I could have been doing and was training people to do. And I did another 2-year tour with the Royal Navy as the senior pilot on an F4 Phantom squadron. The F4 was what I flew with the US Navy. And in fact, I did have to eject once from a burning F-4 into the Pacific, and survived to live the tale. And so I did another 2 years of tour with the Royal Navy, but it was mainly in the Mediterranean and the east coast of America because the empire had kind of crumbled a bit by then. And I decided to quit the Navy and I resigned. I was on a career path, but I decided I had enough, not because of my move to the peace side of things, but because there weren't any more flying jobs available and I didn't fancy driving a desk in the Admiralty in London or even driving a destroyer. So I left and I joined British Overseas Airways Corporation and flew for a number of years all over the world, every country just about, except in South America and West Africa. And then I got furloughed from British Airways and went and flew for St. Lucia Airways in the Caribbean for a period of time. And it was at that time that the Royal Naval Reserve Air Branch came back into being. It had been abandoned or discontinued after the Korean War, but I was asked to become a lieutenant commander, which was my original rank in the Royal Naval Air Reserve, to fly a single-seat fighter. Now, I was living in the States by now, and this seemed an extraordinary thing, and it really started to sink home on me, the stupidity of what I was doing, because every year I'd go over for a month and fly a single-seat fighter in a NATO exercise in Scandinavia, doing simulated strikes on German fast patrol boats, getting jumped on the way home, having refueled in Stavanger in Norway by Danish F-16 fighters. And that's when I really started to question what I was doing and had been doing. And at that time, I was still a member of the Princeton Officers Society at the Nassau Club in Princeton. And the first of four people who influenced me was the Reverend Ernest Gordon, who had been the dean of the Princeton University Chapel for 26 years. And he'd been a prisoner of war of the Japanese on the Burma Road, in fact, on the River Kwai, and he wrote a wonderful book called Through the Valley of the Kwai. And he counseled me a lot because he had obviously been through it all. And after the war, he spent a lot of time in Japan counseling the youth about our atomic bombing and, of course, the crimes that the Japanese had committed, particularly in Manchuria. So he helped me a lot. And then, of course, I was fortunate to meet the Reverend Bob Moore, who has been a tremendous help for me in guiding me along the way in my transition. And I'm so proud to be a member of the Coalition for Peace Action, and I try to do as much as I can. Another piece of irony was that there was a fellow member of the Coalition for Peace Action, Bill Strong, and I still, although I'd seen the light about militarism, I still wanted my logbooks kept in good shape because they recorded every single mission I had flown with all the details, and I had 4 of them, and they were looking a bit ratty. Well, it turned out Bill was a bookbinder. So I went to his house to have them bookbound and saw that on his lawn, he had a sign, the peace dove, and the sign saying, "War is not the answer." So I sat with him and had a long chat. It turned out he was a Quaker. So he was one of the 2 that really influenced me into Quakerism. And the 4th guy was in fact a Quaker. I've been tutoring at the adult education program at the Trenton Soup Kitchen for many, many years, 15 years or so. And a fellow tutor was a wonderful guy called Dr. Christian Hansen, who had been a pediatrician to the poor all over the world. And when he died, we all went to his Quaker meeting memorial service in Buckingham, Pennsylvania. And it was a wonderful experience. And a lot of the adult students, they were all adult students at the soup kitchen. A lot of them had lives had been totally messed up. Some had come out of jail, but everyone could stand up as you can at a Quaker meeting and say nice things, which they did. But the final eulogy was given by Dr. Christian Hansen's eldest son. And he said, "My dad is a wonderful guy, but he is a little bit quirky, and I'll demonstrate what I mean by that." And he held up a photograph of his father standing on the south rim of the Grand Canyon, and he's totally naked except for a pair of hiking boots. So I thought, well, okay, so there's a little bit of humor in Quakerism as well. So now my focus is very much on trying to help as much as I can in the name of peace. But on top of my piece, and I'll get back to it in a moment, I have done a lot of volunteer work abroad. I've been sponsoring kids and families from many countries with an organization which is now called Plan International, which started in the Spanish Civil War and it was called Child Reach, to really help the orphans and waifs and strays after the terrible bombing, and such as Guernica, which of course is the famous picture by Pablo Picasso. And I sponsored children in Mali, Senegal, Nepal, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Bolivia, and now in Colombia. And I've spent time with the families in their schools in Nicaragua and El Salvador, twice in El Salvador. And that led me to the Coalition for Peace, the Cross-Cultural Solutions, which is a wonderful organization that unfortunately is struggling, I think because of COVID. But I've taught in schools in Ayacucho in the Peruvian Andes, in the Black Townships to the east of Cape Town, which was a bit of a homecoming with a slight difference from where I lived. And recently, 4 years ago, I worked in two refugee camps in Greece, one Syrian and one Afghan. And of course, there were Afghans there. Some of them had been interpreters, and like we know, is happening now, some of them had been promised that they would get a safe haven into the States, and they hadn't. So that has been a lot of my work at the moment. I'm currently working with Interfaith Rise, helping the current refugees. I'm looking after two lovely mother and daughter Sudanese ladies, and I'm driving them all over the place, helping them out. But going back to the coalition, I leave what I call the strategic issues, like Rob Goldston talked about, the nuclear, because we need the experts like him to handle that. And I concentrate very much on what I call the tactical issues. I have been to 130 countries. I've lived in 5, and I know the Middle East very, very well. I've been to Yemen, and I've been to all the countries actually in the Middle East, except for Israel. And I'm very, very focused on what we're doing, particularly in Yemen, which is an absolute disgrace that we're still supporting Saudi Arabia with aircraft equipment and air-to-air missiles is the latest thing, which Biden assured us we wouldn't be doing, but we are. And as Bob knows only too well, I'm very focused on the drone warfare. Being an aviator, I'm extremely concerned about the development of the drone situation, because it's now a question of no longer boots on the ground, no longer pilots in the air. These drones are really the current and future aviation warfare. And it's very secretive. Nothing is reported unless there happens to be a journalist there, where luckily there were journalists in Kabul when that terrible drone attack that killed 7 children and 3 other adults. And the drone situation is getting worse and worse because, of course, the military industrial complex is laughing all the way to the bank as they supply drones even to Australia now, which is another major issue with this latest development with us in England and Australia, as the focus towards Taiwan, etc. But the drones now are getting bigger. There's one called the Long Shot, which will be carried by a fixed wing aircraft. So that could be carried at, say, 1,000 miles and then launched and fly another 1,000 miles. And the weaponry on board these drones is getting more powerful. And there's even in-flight refueling drones that can be sent up, and the fighter can tuck into them and refuel. And the Royal Navy now has a squadron that is operating drones of warships. So there's a lot of talk that the aircraft carriers may well disappear down the road, not in the immediate future, because they're very not very maneuverable, and they're very vulnerable. By the way, I actually ended up with 627 aircraft carrier deck landings, of which 144 were at night. So the issue of drones, I think, is very, very worrying, because there are now about 100 countries who've got them. China and Russia are supplying them to all the people who don't like us. And even factions like terrorist groups are now getting their hands on drones. And I can just see another type of 9/11 attack onto American and British interests, of course, perhaps a hotel where Americans stay, or perhaps an embassy, and perhaps even on being put on a ship and getting closer to the US shores and launching a drone from that. So it's all very concerning. But without Bob and the coalition, I wouldn't have got to where I am now. And I'm so very proud to be a member. I'm thrilled that my book will be coming out. It's just a little bit of a sales pitch. It's 9-inch by 6-inch paperback. It's got 160 pages, 20 chapters, and it'll cost $18.75 plus tax, which makes it around $20. And I have been asked to give quite a lot of book signings and talks, and so it'll make it easy if someone can just give me a $20 bill. But thank you all for listening, and shoot some questions.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was very intriguing, and I'm sure there will be some questions. But in the meantime, we're planning a holiday event, which we hope will be hybrid. And so some of you will be able to come in person if you're comfortable with that. And hopefully Richard's book will be available by then. We're looking at mid-December probably. So I know to start out, I think, Patricia, you have a question.
Yes, I do have a question, and there's a comment in the chat that I will get to after the question. The question is, Richard, your turnaround is amazing, okay, coming from your military background and so forth. My question is, what is the relationship like with you and your previous fellow officers since you have this new aspect on everything?
Well, that's a great question. And I've actually, in some respects, steered clear of a lot of people. Because, of course, a lot of the military are very right-wing, although, of course, there's a very strong Veterans for Peace movement in this country, and I know a number of them. So I have to be very careful. And I'm very interested to see, because my book is going to be published in England through a chain called Waterstones and W.H. Smith. So I suspect I'm going to get quite a lot of backlash from some people. But on the other hand, there are a number of them, one who's actually in a photo in the book, who was a Princeton grad. Amazingly, in my squadron in California, there were 4 graduates from Princeton in my squadron, which is quite incredible. And certainly one of them, I think was running General Atomics, which makes most of the drones. So I haven't talked to him about this. But Don, the other guy who's seen the light too, I mean, he's not active, but he agrees with what I'm doing. So it's a very good question, because I think there will be quite a lot of backlash from some people who still think we should be killing people all over the world, et cetera, et cetera.
I imagine that it must have changed those relationships. There's a comment in the chat, and it's we continue to spend an obscene amounts on building and maintaining aircraft carriers. That's from Mark Peppers. Did you want to comment on that at all? There are some other questions that we will get to after that.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of this vast amount of spending, which, because as you know, the Pentagon budget currently is $778 billion, I think it is. But that's a budget. It's not even what we're spending. And I think, as Bob would agree, it's about 53% of the discretionary budget. It's a horrific number. I'm sure we're going to continue building aircraft carriers, but I'm also going to see, I think we're going to see many more drones on warships. It's very easy to launch them. They don't need a long runway. Getting a fighter off a carrier. I mean, the front of my book is me actually in a Phantom on the catapult, where you're boosted into the air at about 170 miles an hour and about a 200-foot stretch. And so there's a lot of complications on carriers, and something like a drone on a warship I'm sure, is going to be the future of naval warfare, naval and aerial warfare.
It's interesting you mentioned drones, because that was a question posed by Dossier Hammond, who I wanted you to talk more about drones and what we can do to reduce and, if anything, eliminate them.
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is make the public aware, because there's very little coverage in the press. I mean, even MSNBC, which I think is quite a left-wing channel, they went for over a year without mentioning any drone attacks at all. And I'm sad to say Obama was the guy who really started escalating the drone situation. And I think a lot of people have no idea. They think the drone is that little thing you can buy on Amazon and fly it in your backyard, when they're extremely powerful and getting bigger and bigger. As some of you know, we do demonstrate outside the old Navy Willow Grove Drone Command Center in Horsham, Pennsylvania. We were there about a month ago. And that is one of the many drone command centers where the signals are all sent all to Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany, which the Germans didn't know about until about 5 years ago. And from there, the signals are then sent to the launching pads. And we've got them all dotted around the Middle East in particular. We've even got them in the Philippines. We've got them in Chad. We've got them in Niger. We're killing people in Somalia. I think it's all about education and trying to get people to understand that this should not be the future. I mean, all warfare should end personally, but this is a horrific way because anybody can get their hands on a drone. Anybody can kill people with drones. And what we've been doing, and it started unfortunately with President Obama, was that any man or boy of 16 years or older was deemed to be a militant and could be killed with an aerial drone. And that's just what's happening. And when I was in Greece in the refugee camp, we were close to a Greek Air Force base. Now, a lot of these, particularly the kids in this camp, had all experienced drones in Syria circling their villages for hours and hours and hours, and then eventually launching a missile at them. So when a fighter from the Greek Air Force base flew over a refugee camp, all the kids ran away and hid in the bushes because it was just like what they'd experienced at home. So it is a very disturbing situation. You won't find much of it in the mainstream media. You will if you read people like Nick Turse, Tom Dispatch, all these other Truth Diggers now off the air, I think, at the moment. Code Pink is very good. There's a lot of Code Pink. And of course, Ro Khanna, the congressman from California, is very much against the drones. So it's all a question of publicity, I think, that we need to spread the word.
Yes, thank you, Richard. And I do want to add to that answer. And in the meantime, Marco, I do see your hand up. If you would be kind enough to type your question in to the chat box, that would help us keep things sort of tight here as we wind toward a close. So we did, with the generous support of the Open Society Foundations, we were able to start a national outreach project that we started with a conference at Princeton Seminary to the faith communities all over the country. And we called it the Interfaith Network on Drone Warfare. It was launched in January of 2015. And just to give you an idea, sometimes you can be surprised if you put the word out there. We thought we were going to get 60 to 70 people. And so we had reserved a fairly small facility at Princeton Seminary, and we got 150 people who wanted to come.
Right.
So that was a very strong takeoff of it. We did raise a lot of consciousness. And one thing I want everyone to be aware of is that we do have different levels within our goals and our organizing. And so we often have to start with things that are much more modest before we can get, I would love to ban drones immediately, if not sooner, for everybody. That would certainly make us all a lot safer. You know, this network, Interfaith Network on Drone Warfare, we had done for 5 years with generous funding, as I said. And even though we didn't get to our final goal, I was recently on a conference call with other faith leaders that Barbara Lee, one of our great peace heroes for many, many years, with her chief of staff, and what she is seriously thinking about having a bill to ban drone strikes by the CIA for the US, because those have no accountability at all. At least if they're done through the military, as unfortunately the recent one in Afghanistan was. It killed a lot of innocent people, but at least there's some visibility and accountability. So we have to realize that we're going to, in most of the time, have. I do see Marco's question. We'll have that, and then I have a final wrap-up comment. Marco's question is to not end the military budget because it hasn't worked. Okay, should our focus be to not end the military budget because it hasn't worked, but push the companies and the military to repurpose the technology for peace? A good example is the internet and turning guns into guitars. Are there any examples of that you can think of, Richard?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a continuing problem that we're spending more than the next 10 countries combined on the military. And I don't think we would suffer at all if we cut back 100 million and used it for all what we need domestically. But of course, the big issue is the military-industrial congressional complex, which we call it now, because they are in control. There's no question about it. And the MICC, as I call it, to them, it doesn't matter if we haven't won a war since World War II, which we haven't. We have not won one war. We've never declared war, and we haven't won one war. And yet they make money over and over again. So all they want is warfare. And I think their control over so many of the politicians, and they're very clever because they don't have all their factories in one state. They spread them out all over the countryside. So it's jobs for everybody. And of course, the politicians in those states and communities love it. And so it's a very difficult situation, I think, to get around. But the fact that we have, and I was talking to Ram earlier today about it, the fact that we have 400 military bases in this country and 800 overseas is absolutely staggering. When in fact, Russia, I think, has 5 outside the old Soviet bloc, of which 3 are in Syria, where they have a treaty with Syria. And China, I think, has maybe 2 or 3. One is in Djibouti, where we have a drone base, and another in an island off Myanmar. So it's going to be a very long haul to get the amount of money spent on the military reduced and put it to much better uses. And more money is being pushed into the drone warfare. I mean, I'm going on and on about drones, but it does really concern me. Boeing is now building drones for Australia. Australia has got this terrible right-wing Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, who is sort of gagging for I think, to attack China over Taiwan and all this sort of nonsense. So it's a very difficult situation, but thanks for the question, Marco.
Well, thank you, Richard, and let's show our appreciation to Richard before I make my final closing remark. That I think all 3 of our speakers were outstanding, and we're ending close to on time. So that's another miracle. See, miracles happen around here. My comment is actually in response to a broader question that Reverend Carol Haig had asked earlier, which is, what can average people do? We are so grateful for people like Professor Goldston, of course, that are world-class experts. And I guess one thing I've learned, and actually there was a question asked at the very first conference, the founding conference of the Coalition for Peace Action, can we reverse the nuclear arms race? And we had world-class experts at that too, a number of them. And basically the surprising thing is almost all of them said, don't pay attention to the nuclear priesthood, the sort of professionals in the field. They're probably not going to get it done. We do need people like Professor Goldston, of course, to help point us in the right direction. But what's really needed is the political pressure and the common sense and the conscience, the community of conscience, to get mobilized. And when we do that, and by the way, that first question has been decisively answered. The nuclear arms race was reversed starting in 1987, and it was because of the work of the nuclear freeze movement. Many of you were involved in that. We generated so much pressure on the Reagan administration that by 1987, most of the way through Ronald Reagan's second term, he had signed with Gorbachev the first nuclear reduction treaty in history. We've had a number of nuclear reduction treaties that have followed that, and the number of nuclear weapons in the world have been reduced by more than 85%. That's to the credit of people like us, average people who just took to the streets, who spread the word, who wrote letters to the editor, who emailed or contacted their members of Congress. I think stopping the Iraq war is definitely a tribute to the American people and the US peace movement as well. So these are challenging issues. We shouldn't say we don't know enough, because we know the basics of what is the right general direction to go in. Yes, we need our technical experts to help guide us as we try to implement treaties and propose them. But the most important single factor is the pressure that we, especially in the democratic countries of the world, that we can and must generate. And that is our path toward a world that is more peaceful and has nuclear reductions going all the way toward our goal of 0. We do now have a specific way to get there. which is the nuclear ban treaty approved at the United Nations by over 120 countries in 2017. So we have milestones that we need to reach, but right now we need to make sure that this next escalation of nuclear weapons that Professor Goldston described so well, if we follow the kind of guidelines that he gave and generate the pressure to back up those sound ideas, I am convinced that we can reverse this and get the world on a path toward abolishing nuclear weapons for everyone. That's my closing thought. Thank you all so much for joining us. Special thanks to Reverend Patricia Hall, our new Assistant Director, for helping with this Zoom event. Thanks all of you for coming, and have a wonderful rest of your day. We look forward to seeing you soon. The recording of this event and Professor Goldston's slides will be available soon. So watch for that, watch your inbox, or just check our website, peacecoalition.org. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day. Peace
Bye-bye.
be with all of you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Patricia.
Bye-bye.